In the jungles of New Guinea, on the windswept shores of the Aleutians, in the searing heat of the Pacific Islands, and the sub-zero skies over Germany, in Burma, Iceland, the Philippines, Iran, France, China, and Italy. Americans fought across a theater of war stretching nearly 7/8 of the globe. They came from the green hills of New England, the sun-scorched plains of the Midwest, the cotton fields of the South, the crowded streets of Manhattan and Chicago, the roaring factories of Detroit and Los Angeles, and the wide open spaces of the Southwest. From hills and plains, from small towns and great cities, they were bookkeepers and soda jerks, mechanics and college students, rich men and poor, beggars and thieves, doctors, lawyers, merchants, and chiefs. Now they were battle-tested soldiers, veterans, and yet just 2 years before, many had never fired a rifle, seen the ocean, or left the ground. They were Americans, fighting for their country, half a world away from it, fighting not just for a place, but for something greater, an idea. An idea larger than the land itself. Without the idea, America might have remained only a wilderness. Without America, the idea might have remained only a dream. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We began as 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic shore. We moved westward, across the Alleghenies, over the Ohio River, past the Mississippi, and finally across the last distant ridges of the Rockies. And with every step, we carried freedom with us. No aristocracy here. No kings, no nobles, no princes, no state church, no royal courts, no idle classes living off others, no divine right of man to rule man. Here, humanity made a fresh start, a clean break. We built a new world from scratch, a world grounded in freedom. Behind us, we left new states, forged from the land, shaped by the spirit of liberty. Until finally we became one nation, united not by bloodlines but by belief, a land of hope and opportunity, rising from the doubts of a skeptical world. A light began to shine, freedom's light, and across oceans and across generations, people saw that light and turned toward it. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. They came, strangers to one another, and together they built a country, and in return the country built them into something new. Yes, it was the sweat of men from all nations that built America, and also their blood. For the blood of Americans has been shed, freely and bravely, to defend this idea. 5 times in our history, we have faced the challenge to that idea, the idea that all men are created equal, that all are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That idea is what made this nation. But it was not innovation alone that lifted us. It was innovation joined with enterprise, and both guided by a hard-won democratic ideal, the greatest good for the greatest number. That ideal built, for the average man, the highest standard of living the world has ever known. 32.5 million registered automobiles, 2/3 of all the cars on Earth. We set high standards, in sanitation, in food purity, in medical care, Our hospitals are models. Our science, widely copied. We believe the best should be available to every man, woman, and child, especially the child. We've reduced the hazard of birth. From that moment on, we protect, and yes, even spoil, the majority of our children. But it doesn't seem to hurt them. They thrive. They go to school, all kinds of schools, kindergarten, public and private, trade schools, 25,000 high schools, and colleges across the nation. In the last war, only 20% of our servicemen had finished high school or gone to college. In this war, 63%. We are a working people, but also a people who know how to rest. We believe in vacations. 2 weeks a year, we hunt and fish, from the forests of the north to the coasts of the south, from the mountains of the west to the rivers of the east. We are a sports-loving nation. And likely the most traveled people in history. We love to go, and we can, because we built the roads, we have the cars, we have the scenery. We don't need passports, though now and then we might need an alibi. We sleep by the road, we eat by the road. And our roadside menus often leave the foreign visitor amazed and a little baffled. We are a people who like to belong to clubs, fraternities, unions, federations. Give us a cause, a purpose, and we'll sign up. We love our radios. There's one in the living room, the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom, the car. And if not in our hand, maybe up our sleeve. Music? We couldn't live without it. Our press is the largest in the world, but more importantly, it is the freest. Over 12,000 newspapers reflect every shade of opinion, books on every subject. More than 6,000 magazines, not even counting the comic books. And religion? We embrace every faith under the sun. We have every denomination on earth, and 60 million of us attend services regularly. But no one dares tell us which church or whether to go at all. We elect our neighbors to govern us. We believe in individual enterprise and in equal opportunity for both men and women. Yes, we make mistakes. We sometimes rise too fast and fall just as hard. We chase after false prosperity and stumble into preventable recessions. But we learn, we adapt, we correct our course, and we move forward. Because at our core, we never lose faith, not in ourselves and not in the future. We believe in the future, we build for it, and before we even finish building, we invent something new and begin again. That's the kind of people we are. At times boastful, often easygoing, occasionally sentimental. But beneath all of it, we are fiercely committed to the ideals passed down to us, the liberty and dignity of man. We've made enormous material progress, but spiritually, we are still pioneers, still exploring, still searching. Yet deep within us is a longing, a deep yearning for peace, for brotherhood, for goodwill among men. We believe that if humanity applied the same ingenuity to peace as it has to transportation, communication, or flight, then war itself would become as obsolete as the horse and buggy. We do not glorify war, we hate it, because we know, always, it is the common man who bears the cost, the common man who suffers, the common man who dies. But if our freedoms are threatened, if the ideals we hold dear are endangered, we will fight, we will sacrifice, we will endure, and if necessary, we will fight to the last man. That is America. Why? Is this fight truly necessary? Did we ask for war? Back in 1917, before most of you fighting men were even born, our fathers went to war, the First World War, to make the world safe for democracy and for the common man. They fought with purpose. They won. And they believed, hoped, that there would be no more war, not in their time, and not in ours. Faithful to our treaty obligations, we dismantled much of our naval power. Our army was reduced until it was little more than a skeleton force. War, we thought, had been outlawed. To us, Europe was distant. Asia, well, Asia felt like another world entirely, the kind of place you'd only see in the pages of National Geographic. And yet it was there, in a remote corner of Asia in 1931, while most of you were still building sandcastles, that the next war began. Without warning, Japan invaded Manchuria. Once again, peaceful people became the victims of violent ambition. In Washington, our Secretary of State issued a forceful protest. The American government will not recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement brought about through aggression. But we, the American people, had little time to dwell on Manchuria. We were facing our own crisis, the worst economic depression in our nation's history. Some of us had no jobs. Others waited in breadlines. Some faced hardship at home that felt like war of another kind: poverty, hunger, despair. Some were broken. Some were buried. Then in 1933, while most of you were finishing high school, we read of a strange little man named Hitler who had come to power in Germany. A movement called the Nazi Party had risen. But in 1935, about the time many of you went on your first date, we learned that Mussolini had launched an attack on distant Ethiopia. The disease of war was spreading, so Congress met to protect us from the rising tide.
We want no war. We'll have no war, save in defense of our own people or our own honor.
To that end, our elected leaders passed the Neutrality Act. No nation at war could purchase arms or munitions from the United States. That was the law. By 1936, while many of you were still cruising around in jalopies, troubling news was coming out of Spain. In our newsreels, we watched with growing unease as German and Italian planes and troops joined the fighting. What were they doing there? For the first time, we saw entire cities reduced to rubble. Civilians, women, children, the elderly, bombed and killed from the skies. That same year, in November 1936, the American Institute of Public Opinion, better known as the Gallup poll, asked a simple question. If another war breaks out in Europe, should America get involved? The answer was overwhelming. No. 95% of Americans said we should stay out of it. 19 out of 20. The message was clear. Include us out. To reinforce that stance, Congress added a cash and carry provision to the Neutrality Act. Not only would we refuse to sell weapons or ammunition to warring nations, we wouldn't sell them anything at all, not even a spool of thread, unless they came here with their own ships and paid in cash. Then in 1937, a flash from Asia hit the newswires. Japan was turning Asia into a slaughterhouse. Still, to most Americans, Asia remained a distant foreign place. That September, Gallup asked again, "In the conflict between Japan and China, where do your sympathies lie?" 43% of Americans said they sympathized with China. 2% said Japan. The rest, 55%, were undecided. We hadn't made up our minds, and legally, our hands were tied. The Neutrality Act only applied to countries that had officially declared war. Japan hadn't, so we continued doing business, selling scrap metal and aviation gasoline to the very nation bombing its neighbors. Hitler and his circle met the anxious leaders of Britain and France at Munich. There he promised peace in our time, on one condition, that they hand over the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. Desperate to avoid another war, Britain and France agreed. They gave him what he wanted. In return, they had his word, a promise of peace. We believed, or at least hoped, that it might be true. But back home, we were beginning to hear disturbing headlines. In movie theaters, we watched newsreels exposing Nazi espionage operations on American soil.
As Germans, we know that if America is to be free, we must destroy the chain that ties the whole misery of American politics together. And that chain is the United States Constitution.
These weren't just lines from fiction. Subversive actions were happening in real life. German-American Bund rallies, openly sympathetic to Hitler's regime, marched right under our noses. Meanwhile, overseas, we read reports of Germany rearming at breakneck speed. And of Japan turning itself into a military powerhouse. These so-called have-not nations were pouring millions into their war machines, and we wondered, why? But they'd already told us why, long before the shooting started.
There's actually been a war since the day when we lifted the flag of our revolution against the democratic world. Germans are a noble and unique race, to whom the earth was given by the grace of God. The world must come to look up to our emperor as the great ruler of all nations.
The people of Germany, Italy, and Japan had followed leaders who declared war not just on countries, but on the very idea of freedom. Freedom of speech, of religion, of equality, of the individual. Everything that made America what it was stood in direct opposition to their cause. So in December 1938, when Gallup asked the American people if we should strengthen our military, our Army, Navy, and Air Force, 85% said yes. We were beginning to understand.
Gentlemen, this is the Military Affairs Committee of the United States House of Representatives meeting for the purpose of considering national defense.
The Navy is asking for an increase of 25% in authorized naval tonnage in view of the grave international situation.
We had to prepare. Congress listened. It passed the largest peacetime military appropriation in our nation's history, though in hindsight, it would later look like a mere down payment. Then on March 14, 1939, Hitler broke the very promise he made at Munich. He seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. So much for peace in our time. By Good Friday, April 7th, the picture was becoming clear.
Extra paper, Italy attacks Albania.
Violent, conquering forces had been unleashed upon the world. And where would they stop? In a final attempt to prevent a global conflict, President Roosevelt sent personal appeals to Hitler and Mussolini, asking them to pledge they would not invade 30 independent nations. Hitler read out the names of those countries before the Reichstag, mocking the message to thunderous laughter.
Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina, Ägypten.
That was the only reply Roosevelt ever received. Then, on September 1st, 1939, the Nazi war machine stormed into Poland. Britain and France had pledged to defend the Poles. Would they act? At home, Americans listened closely.
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war a certainty. Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain gave the Nazi dictator a 0 hour for withdrawing his troops from Poland. That 0 hour ends now. At this time, we transfer you to London for an important announcement by the British Prime Minister.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. Now may God bless you all, and may He defend the right, for it is evil things that we shall be fighting against, and against them I am certain that the right will prevail.
6 hours after Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the Republic of France followed. All France is in a maelstrom of activity.
When asked, who do you believe is responsible for starting this war? 82% of Americans answered, Germany. We knew who started it, and many of us began to fear that this war would eventually reach us too. President Roosevelt called a special session of Congress to reconsider the arms embargo.
I have asked the Congress to reassemble an extraordinary session in order that it may consider and act on changes in our neutrality law.
The question was simple but heavy. Should America continue to forbid selling weapons to nations at war?
The arms embargo is far too great a security to American peace to permit its surrender without a last-ditch fight.
The Embargo Act, as it now stands, is one-sided and works entirely to the advantage of one side. Therefore, the Embargo Act should be modified.
Congress debated. So did the people. When Gallup asked the public whether the Neutrality Act should be revised to allow arms sales, 57% said yes, and shortly after the law was changed. We lifted the embargo on arms and munitions. From now on, we would sell weapons, but only to nations that paid in cash and carried the goods away on their own ships. American vessels remained barred from entering combat zones. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Japan was waging a brutal campaign against China, bombing, shooting, and terrorizing civilians in an effort to force submission. As we watched the conflict unfold, a sobering realization set in. If Japan succeeded in conquering 400 million Chinese, it could become powerful enough to push us right out of the Pacific altogether. Just 2 years earlier, in September 1937, a Gallup poll asked Americans where their sympathies lay in the war between China and Japan. Only 43% supported China. The majority of us remained undecided, but by June 1939, things had changed. When asked again, 74% of Americans declared their sympathy was with China. The fog had lifted. We had made up our minds. So when scrap iron was loaded onto Japanese ships, public outrage followed. Americans protested, demanding that we stop supplying materials to the very country attacking civilians.
In 1940, the restriction of exports to Japan took the form of moral embargoes of aeroplanes and direct munitions. Then Congress passed the Export Control Act, and increasing cutoffs of scrap iron, aviation gasoline, and other strategic items followed. Exports were curtailed to the limit which those responsible for our defense were willing to risk. It was a fearful responsibility. On one side was the possibility, in fact the probability, that one day these materials might be used against us. On the other side was the possibility, in fact the probability, that to cut them off would provoke an attack which we were not then prepared to resist. Finally, in the summer of 1941, as it became clear that Japan was turning her back upon every possibility of reconciliation and adjustment, and was determined upon her great gamble of conquest, all exports ceased.
Then came April 9th, 1940. Nazi Germany shifted into high gear. First, they overran Denmark. Then they crushed Norway. On May 10th, 1940, Hitler's armies invaded the Netherlands and Belgium.
The Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history. All roads in France are choked with slow-moving masses of refugees. Nazi dive bombers are scraping and bombing thousands of helpless women and children.
Mr. Kaltenborn.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany. The army of French and British has made a valiant battle in its effort to retreat to Dunkirk, where there is some slight chance that some part of it can be evacuated.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
This is William L. Shirer speaking from the forest of Compiègne, where Adolf Hitler today is handing his armistice terms to France. It is 3:15 p.m. Adolf Hitler strides slowly toward the little clearing. I can see his face. It is grave, solemn, yet brimming with revenge. Off to one side is a large statue of Marshal Foch. Hitler does not appear to see it. Now we see the French walking down the avenue, led by General Hunsinger. Hitler and the other German leaders rise as the French enter. General Keitel reads the preamble to the German armistice terms. This whole ceremony is over in a quarter of an hour.
One by one, nations fell. Nazi forces now stood on the Atlantic coast. The danger had suddenly arrived at our doorstep, and it didn't stop in Europe. The countries conquered by the Nazis held territories outside the continent, some right here in the Americas. Would Hitler demand control of French naval units in Martinique? Would the Nazis seize the Dutch oil fields in Curaçao? Would they occupy the French base at Dakar and use it to launch an invasion of South America? The threat was real. In Brazil alone, over 1 million ethnic Germans lived as if they had never left the Reich. There were 1,200 German schools teaching from Nazi textbooks. Nazi newspapers circulated freely. Even Hermann Göring's glider clubs had chapters in Brazil. Brazil was also home to 260,000 Japanese citizens still loyal to Tokyo. In Ecuador, well within bombing range of the Panama Canal, German airlines operated with pilots who were also Luftwaffe reserve officers. Their planes came equipped with bomb racks already built in. In Argentina, German athletic clubs, modeled after Hitler Youth, trained young Germans exclusively. A fifth column was in place, ready to act. In response, the United States met in Havana with representatives from 20 other American republics.
There must not be a shadow of a doubt anywhere as to the determination of the American nation not to permit the invasion of their hemisphere by the armed forces of any power or any possible combination of power.
Together, the nations of the Western Hemisphere drew a clear line. No European colony in the Americas would be transferred to any non-American power. We said, keep out, and we meant it.
We must increase production facilities for everything needed for the Army and Navy for national defense. I believe that this nation should plan at this time a program that will provide us with 50,000 military and naval planes.
To protect our shores, we authorized construction of a two-ocean navy, the greatest the world has ever known. At least it would be the greatest navy when completed in 1944. But then, in 1940, it was only a paper navy.
The U.S. Army had just 187,000 men. The Navy counted 120,000. And the Air Corps, a mere dot, numbered only 22,387. That gave us a total active force of about 330,000. Much of our equipment was outdated or improvised. We had just 235 feet of field artillery, 10 light tanks, and 18 medium ones. Supplies were so limited that mess kits and trucks were stamped and shared. That was the state of America's armed forces in May 1940, the very month Hitler overran France. In response, we took action. We mobilized the National Guard units from all 48 states and placed them under federal control. But most importantly, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. For the first time in American history, we began building an army before war had even reached our shores. We acted just in time. The clock was ticking and the Nazis were tightening their grip on Britain.
This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began. Anti-aircraft guns were in action along the southeast coast today.
Back on Main Street, USA, we followed Britain's desperate struggle for survival day by day, because if Britain fell, our own safety would be in jeopardy. The British fleet, our first line of defense across the Atlantic, could fall into Nazi hands. Our shores would lie exposed. Our homes and families would be in danger. Britain could not fall. In our own harbors, rusting and long forgotten, sat old destroyers, built for World War I and now gathering dust. But this was World War II, and those aging ships sparked an idea. We revitalized 50 of them and transferred them to Great Britain. In exchange, we gained something priceless, a defensive shield. We secured a string of military bases stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana, forming a steel arc around the Caribbean. These bases protected the Panama Canal and signaled to the Axis powers that the United States was awake to the threat. Assistant Secretary of State Mr. Burley later revealed how the Axis responded.
From 1936 on, it became increasingly clear to the world that Germany, Italy, and Japan were pursuing a common pattern of aggression, both in Europe and in the Far East. On September 27, 1940, these three powers signed the so-called Pact of Berlin, or Tripartite Pact, a treaty of far-reaching alliance. By that treaty, it was provided that the three countries would assist one another with all political, economic, and military means when one of the powers was attacked, note particularly the use of the word attack, by a power not then involved in the European war or in the Chinese-Japanese conflict. The last of these provisions was aimed directly at the United States.
Tokyo celebrated. Rome cheered. And Berlin roared with approval. But their joy was short-lived, because the three Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had finally made their intentions clear. They stood united against us.
Despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war.
England will not only survive, England will win.
So when Americans were asked, should we stay out of the war or support Britain even if it risks war? 68% said support Britain, even if it meant facing war ourselves. Back in 1936, only 1 in 20 Americans believed we'd ever get involved. By 1941, 14 out of 20 were ready to risk war to stop the Axis.
I asked this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves. We shall send in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
Congress heard the will of the people and passed the Lend-Lease Act, Bill number 1776, a modern declaration of independence. Independence not just for us, but for free people everywhere, under threat from tyranny. Then the Nazi war machine roared forward again. On April 6, 1941, it crushed Yugoslavia and Greece. On June 22nd, without warning, Hitler turned east and launched his biggest gamble yet, a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. And we responded. We extended Lend-Lease aid to Russia and other victims of aggression. American-made supplies were now flowing into British ports, through the Red Sea into Africa, across the Burma Road into China, and into Murmansk and Iran for the Russians. Why did we do it? Yes, because we sympathized with those fighting for their freedom. Yes, because we had always opposed empires built on conquest. But more than anything, we did it because we knew we were next. Hitler had made it clear. America, the leading symbol of liberty, was on his list.
Two worlds are in conflict, two philosophies of life. One of these two worlds must break asunder.
If Germany conquered Europe and Africa, it would gain not just territory, but control over vast natural resources and a massive industrial base.
Of the 2 billion people in the world, the Nazis would rule roughly 1/4.
500 million people would be forced into slave labor for the Nazi war machine.
Forced into slavery, the labor for Germany.
If Germany also conquered Russia, it would add one of the world's largest supplies of raw materials and 200 million more people to its empire. If Japan dominated the Orient, it would unlock nearly limitless resources and enslave 1 billion more human beings. We in the Americas would be left standing alone, while we would be left with only 3/10. The Axis would control 7/10 of the world's resources. They would command 3 global industrial centers to our 1. They would have 7/8 of the world's population to our 1/8. If we and our allies in the Western Hemisphere could raise an army of 30 million, the Axis could raise 200 million. An Axis victory in Europe and Asia would leave us surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and alone. That is why we, the American people, demanded change. We rewrote the Neutrality Act. We sent aid to Britain, to Russia, to China. We became the arsenal of democracy. And that's why, for the first time, American troops set out across the Atlantic to man new bases in Greenland and Iceland, with the full agreement of those nations' governments. We were not yet at war. In our hands, military bases meant defense. In the hands of the Nazis, they became launch points for aggression. Germany initiated a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare.
If today our Navy should make secure the seas for the delivery of our munitions to Great Britain, it will render as great a service to our country and to the preservation of American freedom as it has ever rendered in all its glorious history.
We want those cargoes protected.
In response, the U.S. Congress repealed the Neutrality Acts. American merchant ships were armed and, for the first time, sailed directly into combat zones to deliver Lend-Lease supplies. While the Atlantic conflict escalated, events in the Pacific were also heating up. Under the guise of an agreement with Vichy France's puppet regime, Japan moved into Indochina. At this point, only two obstacles stood in the way of Japan's ambition to dominate Greater East Asia. The first was their northern neighbor, the Soviet Union, the only military power within immediate reach. But Nazi Germany was already engaged in a brutal campaign against the Soviets. The second threat to Japan's expansionist goals was the United States. Japan's planned southward expansion was too risky as long as American bases remained operational in the Philippines and supply lines to Wake, Midway, and Hawaii stayed open. The United States was in Japan's way, and from Tokyo's perspective had to be dealt with. To Washington came Special Ambassador Saburo Kurusu on what the Japanese called a mission of peace. But his arrival was carefully coordinated with the departure of a Japanese naval task force operating under sealed orders, not bound for peace. On November 14th, Kurusu arrived in San Francisco, wearing a broad smile and speaking of friendship. Japan, he claimed, was a peace-loving nation.
The Japanese were a peace-loving people. Their whole policy was devoted to the establishment of permanent peace in Asia. Our aid to China was delaying the establishment of that peace. Our refusal to sell them oil and scrap was interfering with the establishment of that peace. Our objections to their taking over the East Indies, Greater East Asia, was an interruption in the establishment of that peace. All they wanted was peace.
On November 17th, Kurusu, along with Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, was received by President Roosevelt in the presence of Secretary of State Cordell Hull. It quickly became apparent that Japan had brought no new proposals. Their aim remained the same: conquest of China and East Asia. Nevertheless, on November 26th, Secretary Hull presented Japan with a proposal for a peaceful resolution. That proposal was forwarded to Tokyo. Japan needed to stall, but not for long. Their naval task force was already en route to its target. Sunday, December 7th, 1941. (1 p.m.) Japanese emissaries are scheduled to meet with U.S. officials at the State Department to present their government's response. 1:05 p.m. Japanese aircraft approach Hawaii. 1:10 p.m. The emissaries called to postpone their meeting until 1:45. 1:20 p.m. The attack on Pearl Harbor is underway. "2 p.m. Ambassadors Caruso and Nomura arrive at the State Department, polite and composed. 2:20 p.m. As Japanese planes have been bombing American outposts for over an hour, the diplomats present a memorandum to Secretary Hull.
Here is the memorandum sent it to me. As you can see, it is quite a lengthy document. I read it hurriedly, discovering that it contained a recital of monstrous accusations against the United States, charging it, among other things, with, quote, scheming for the extension of the war, preparing to attack Germany and Italy, two powers striving to establish a new order in Europe, and ignoring Japan's sacrifices in the 4 years of the China affair, menacing the empire's existence itself, and disparaging its honor and prestige. After reading the note, I said to the Japanese emissaries, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge, and I never imagined that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them.
I ask that the Congress declare by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.